Welcome to Chapter 14. Today we enter the domain that separates organizations that talk about compliance from organizations that can prove it. Accountability. The GDPR's demand that you not only follow the rules, but demonstrate that you follow them. Here's our path through it. We begin with the accountability principle itself. Article 5.2, the short sentence that transformed data protection from a rule book into a governance discipline. Then, the design obligations of Article 25. Data protection by design, building privacy into systems from the first sketch, and data protection by default, ensuring the out-of-the-box settings protect people who never touch a single option. Next, the paperwork that regulators request on day one of any investigation. Records of processing activities under Article 30, the master inventory of everything you do with personal data, and the Article 31 duty to cooperate with supervisory authorities. And then the centerpiece, data protection impact assessments. When Article 35 makes them mandatory, the blacklists supervisory authorities publish what a proper DPIA contains, and the Article 36 prior consultation that kicks in when residual risk stays high. Think of this chapter as building your organization's evidence file before anyone asks for it, because someday someone will ask. Let's get building. Let's begin with the sentence that changed everything. Article 5.2. The controller shall be responsible for and be able to demonstrate compliance with the principles. 14 words, 2 duties: comply and prove it. We met this principle in Chapter 4. Today, we live inside its consequences. Why do I call it transformative? Because of what it replaced. Under older regimes, compliance was largely reactive. Follow the rules, and if a regulator ever came knocking, argue your case then. Accountability inverts the timeline. The evidence must exist before the knock. When an authority opens an investigation, its first letter says, in essence, show us. Show us your records of processing. Show us the legal basis analysis for this activity. Show us the DPIA, the training logs, the vendor contracts, the breach register. An organization that complies beautifully but documents nothing arrives at that moment empty-handed, and in the regulator's eyes, undocumented compliance is indistinguishable from no compliance. Here's the analogy I've used for years, and clients never forget it. Compliance without accountability is claiming you drove safely. Accountability is having the dashcam footage. The claim might even be true, but only the footage settles arguments. What does the evidence file actually contain? Think in layers. Governance artifacts, policies, assigned roles, a privacy program with an owner, operational records, the Article 30 inventory, DPIAs, legitimate interest assessments, consent logs, retention schedules, relationship proof, processor contracts, transfer safeguards, TIAs, and living evidence, training completions, audit results, breach documentation, review cycles that show the program breathes. And notice the quiet strategic gift inside the burden. Building this file forces you to actually understand your data. Every documented flow is a flow someone examined. Accountability, done honestly, isn't paperwork about compliance. It's the mechanism that produces compliance. Hold that thought. The rest of this chapter is that mechanism, piece by piece. Now for the obligation that moves privacy from the legal department into the engineering room. Data protection by design. Article 25(1) requires controllers to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures designed to implement the principles effectively, and to do so both at the time of determining the means of processing and at the time of processing itself. Translate the legalese. Privacy must be built in from the blueprint stage, not bolted on before launch. Why does timing matter so much? Because architecture hardens. Let me tell you about 2 projects I've witnessed. In the first, the privacy team was consulted 3 weeks before a customer platform went live. They found excessive data collection, no deletion mechanism, and identifiers woven through every table. Fixing it meant rebuilding the data model, months of delay, real money, genuine organizational pain. In the second project, a privacy engineer sat in the earliest design workshops. Minimization shaped the schema. Retention rules became automated jobs. Pseudonymization was a native feature. Cost of privacy? Nearly invisible. Same obligation, opposite experiences, and the only variable was when privacy entered the room. Retrofitting is always the expensive path. What does by design look like concretely? The article names pseudonymization and minimization as examples, but the practice is broader. Privacy requirements written into project templates and procurement questionnaires, so no initiative starts without the questions being asked. Data flow diagrams as standard design artifacts. Deletion designed as a feature, not an afterthought, systems that can forget. Access controls conceived with the schema, not patched after. And a privacy review gate in the development lifecycle, the same way security review became standard. Note also the calibration clause. Measures are chosen considering the state of the art, implementation costs, and the nature, scope, context, purposes, and risks of processing. Familiar music by now, proportionality again. A startup's by design looks different from a bank's, but neither gets to skip the thinking. Design is where principles become physics. Design's twin deserves its own spotlight because it protects a specific and precious group, the people who never open the settings menu. Data protection by default, Article 25(2), requires that by default, only personal data necessary for each specific purpose is processed. That obligation covers the amount collected, the extent of processing, the storage period, and accessibility. And it adds one beautifully concrete rule. By default, personal data must not be made accessible to an indefinite number of people without the individual's intervention. Why legislate defaults at all? Because defaults are destiny. Decades of behavioral research and every product manager's dashboard confirm the same truth. The overwhelming majority of users never change preset options. Whatever the default is, that's what most people live with. Which means the entity choosing the default is effectively choosing on behalf of millions. Article 25(2) simply assigns that power a direction. When you choose for the silent majority, choose protectively. Picture the difference in practice. A social app launches with profiles public to the world, location attached to every post, and data shared with partners, all switchable off by the diligent few who find the menus. That architecture inverts the law. Protection exists only for those who intervene, when the GDPR demands exposure exists only for those who intervene. The compliant version ships private by default profiles, location off until enabled, sharing opt-in. Same features, same freedom, opposite default gravity. And the difference is measured in millions of quietly protected people. The rule reaches beyond visibility settings into everyday design choices. Registration forms where only essential fields are mandatory. The phone number is optional and marked so. Retention that auto-deletes when purpose ends, rather than keeping until someone remembers to clean. Internal access granted narrowly by default, widened on justified request, never the reverse. Here's the one-line test I give product teams, and it works in exams too. Imagine a user who installs, accepts nothing extra, touches no settings, and simply uses the thing. Whatever happens to that person's data, that is your default. And Article 25(2) asks one question about it. Is every piece of it necessary? If the honest answer wavers, the default fails. Now for the document every investigation requests first, the record of processing activities, universally known as the RoPA. Article 30 obliges controllers and processors to maintain a written record, electronic counts, of their processing. And I want you to see it not as bureaucratic homework, but as your organization's data map, the master inventory from which everything else navigates. What goes in? For controllers, each processing activity gets an entry containing the controller's name and contacts, the purposes of processing, the categories of data subjects and of personal data, the categories of recipients, any transfers to third countries with identification of safeguards, the envisaged retention periods where possible, and a general description of security measures. Processors keep a leaner mirror, the controllers they serve, the categories of processing performed for each, transfers, and security measures. Read those field lists again slowly and notice something elegant. The RoPA is essentially the whole GDPR in table form. Purposes connect to legal bases. Recipients connect to sharing and contracts. Transfers connect to Chapter 5. Retention connects to storage limitation. A well-built RoPA is a compliance dashboard disguised as an inventory. Now the exemption everyone asks about and almost no one gets to use. Organizations with fewer than 250 employees are exempt, unless the processing is likely to risk rights and freedoms, is more than occasional, or includes special categories or criminal data. Walk through any real small business. Regular payroll, more than occasional. Employee sick notes, special category. Customer database running daily, more than occasional again. The exceptions swallow the exemption nearly whole, which is why the safe professional advice is simply everyone keeps a RoPA. How do you build one that's true rather than aspirational? Interview the business, not just IT. Marketing knows flows the CIO never heard of. Walk data journeys end to end. And the hard part, keep it alive. Stale RoPAs are the most common audit finding I encounter. An inventory describing the organization of 3 years ago. Assign ownership, review on a schedule, update on every new project, which, notice, is exactly where by design gates hand you the information. The pieces of this chapter interlock, that's the design. And when the supervisory authority calls, Article 30 ends with the punchline, the record shall be made available on request. The map is for them as much as for you. Let's talk about the shortest article in this chapter and the professional discipline it implies. Article 31. The controller and the processor shall cooperate on request with the supervisory authority in the performance of its tasks. One sentence, yet it defines how the entire relationship with regulators works in practice. First, understand what cooperation means operationally. When an authority investigates, whether from a complaint, a breach notification, or its own initiative, it sends questions with deadlines. Produce your records of processing for these activities. Explain the legal basis for this data flow. Provide the DPIA for this system. Describe your retention practice, your processor contracts, your training program. Article 31 makes answering these not a courtesy but an obligation, and answering them well requires exactly the evidence file this chapter has been assembling. See how it all converges? The RoPA, the DPIAs, the policies, the logs, they were never paperwork for its own sake. They were pre-written answers to future regulatory questions. Second, understand what poor cooperation costs. Article 83 lists the degree of cooperation with the supervisory authority among the factors calibrating fines. Obstruction, evasion, missed deadlines, and discovered to be hollow answers all aggravate outcomes, while prompt, organized, candid responses mitigate them. Enforcement history bears this out repeatedly. Authorities describe in their decisions how an organization behaved during the investigation, and the tone of that description moves money. Third, the discipline this implies inside your organization. Designate ownership. Someone, typically the DPO or privacy office, owns regulator correspondence, so requests never languish in a general inbox. Build a response protocol before you need it. Who assembles documents? Who reviews answers for accuracy? Who signs? Rehearse with internal mock requests. Ask your own team for the RoPA extract and time the retrieval. And cultivate the candor habit. If something is imperfect, regulators respond far better to "we found this gap and here is our remediation, than to discovering the gap themselves behind a confident denial. The mindset to carry. Regulators are not enemies to outwit, but referees to respect. Organizations with that posture and the files to back it walk out of investigations with reputations intact. The next two slides build the most demanded file of all. Now for accountability's flagship instrument, the Data Protection Impact Assessment. Article 35 requires one where a type of processing, in particular using new technologies, is likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. The DPIA is the GDPR's institutionalized pause before you build the risky thing. Stop, study it, and mitigate on paper first. The threshold phrase is likely to result in a high risk. So the practical question becomes, how do I recognize high risk in advance? The article itself names 3 automatic triggers. First, systematic and extensive evaluation of personal aspects based on automated processing, including profiling, on which decisions with legal or similarly significant effects are based. Here the echo of Article 22, algorithmic credit scoring, is the archetype. Second, large-scale processing of special categories or criminal offense data. A hospital network's patient records, a national research biobank. Third, systematic monitoring of a publicly accessible area on a large scale, citywide CCTV, smart city sensor grids. Beyond the automatic 3, the EDPB's guidelines supply 9 risk criteria to weigh: evaluation or scoring, automated decisions with significant effect, systematic monitoring, sensitive or highly personal data, large scale, matching or combining datasets, vulnerable data subjects, innovative technology, and processing that prevents people from exercising rights or accessing services. The working rule of thumb: 2 or more criteria present, strongly consider a DPIA, and when in doubt, do one anyway. The assessment that proves unnecessary costs you a workshop. The missing assessment that proves necessary costs considerably more. 2 practical aids complete the picture. Supervisory authorities publish blacklists, formally lists under Article 35(4) of processing types requiring DPIAs in their jurisdiction. Employee monitoring, biometric identification, and location tracking feature frequently. Check your authorities list. It converts judgment calls into clear answers. And efficiency is allowed. A single DPIA may cover a set of similar processing operations presenting similar risks. One assessment for the same CCTV setup across 50 stores, not 50 documents. One reflects to build now. The DPIA question belongs at project intake, asked automatically for every new initiative. By design gates, again, doing their quiet work. So a DPIA is required. What does a good one actually contain? Article 35(7) prescribes 4 elements, and I want to walk them as a narrative arc, because a DPIA done well tells a story. Here is what we want to do, here is why it's justified, here is what could go wrong for people, and here is how we've made it safe. Element 1. A systematic description of the processing and its purposes, including, where applicable, the legitimate interests pursued. This is the cartography stage. Data categories, sources, flows, recipients, retention, the technology involved. Be honest and complete here. A DPIA describing a sanitized version of the project protects no one and collapses under regulatory reading. Element 2. An assessment of the necessity and proportionality of the operations in relation to the purposes. The discipline questions from Chapter 9 return. Could we achieve this with less data, shorter retention, narrower access, a gentler method? A DPIA that never considers alternatives isn't assessing, it's ratifying. Element 3, the heart. An assessment of the risks to the rights and freedoms of data subjects. Note whose risks, not the company's fines or reputation, the people's. Think in harm scenarios, discrimination from a biased score, distress from exposure, physical danger from a location leak, exclusion from a service, chilling effects from surveillance. For each, weigh likelihood and severity. A simple risk matrix serves well. Element 4. The measures envisaged to address those risks. Safeguards, security, and mechanisms ensuring protection and demonstrating compliance. Each significant risk meets its mitigation. Pseudonymization here, access restriction there, human review of automated outputs, shortened retention, transparency enhancements. The residual risk after measures is your headline conclusion, and it decides what happens next, as the final slide reveals. Process matters alongside content. The controller must seek the advice of the DPO where one is designated and, where appropriate, seek the views of data subjects or their representatives, worker consultation for employee monitoring, user research for consumer products. And Article 35(11) makes the DPIA a living document. Review when risk changes, when the project pivots, when incidents teach lessons. A DPIA is not a launch formality. It's a companion document for the processing's whole life. We arrive at the chapter's final mechanism, the one triggered when a DPIA ends with an uncomfortable conclusion. Article 36, where the DPIA indicates the processing would result in a high risk in the absence of measures taken by the controller to mitigate it, and the residual risk remains high, the controller must consult the supervisory authority before processing begins. Feel the architecture click into place. The DPIA isn't merely documentation, it's a decision gate with 3 exits. Residual risk low or acceptable after mitigations, proceed, file the DPIA as evidence. Risk unmitigable and unjustifiable, the honest conclusion is don't do this. And yes, real DPIAs do kill real projects. That's the instrument working, not failing. And the middle exit? Risk remains high despite genuine mitigation effort, but you believe the processing is still warranted. Then you don't decide alone. The regulator gets the file before go live. Prior consultation is the system's escalation valve. High-stakes calls rise to the referee. What does consultation involve? You submit the DPIA along with the context, responsibilities of controller and processors, purposes, measures taken, and contact details. The authority then has 8 weeks to respond, extendable by 6 more for complexity, with the clock pausable while they await requested information. If the authority concludes the processing would infringe the regulation, it provides written advice, and remember, from your upcoming enforcement chapter, it can also wield its full corrective toolkit, including warnings and outright bans. Consultation is genuine review, not ceremony. 2 professional notes. First, the sequencing trap. Arriving at Article 36 without a completed, honest DPIA is itself a compliance failure. The consultation exists to review your assessment, not to replace it. Second, the timeline lesson. 8+ weeks of regulatory review belongs in your project plan from the start. I've seen launches wrecked not by the consultation's outcome, but by nobody having budgeted for its existence. Step back and admire the completed structure of this chapter. Principles demand proof. Design builds protection in. Defaults guard the passive. The RoPA maps everything. Cooperation channels it to regulators. DPIAs interrogate the risky. And consultation escalates the unresolved. That is accountability, not a document, a system. And you now know how to build it. Outstanding. Chapter 14 complete. And you've just internalized the machinery that regulators judge organizations by. Accountability as evidence, privacy by design and by default, the RoPA, cooperation duties, the full DPIA methodology, and the Article 36 escalation valve. When someone asks what does GDPR compliance actually look like day to day, this chapter is the answer. Our quick ritual before moving on. If this series keeps delivering for your preparation, subscribe to the channel. One click unlocks this playlist and every other certification playlist we publish, and it fuels more free structured training for the whole community. Hold the sequence steady too. Next chapter completes the accountability picture with its human faces: the data protection officer, when appointment is mandatory, the independence protections, the statutory tasks, plus the auditing discipline that keeps privacy programs honest over time. Today, built the system, tomorrow we meet its guardian. And when practice time comes, our complete CIPP/E course on Udemy stands ready. Chapter quizzes, full-length practice exams in the real test style, role-play scenarios like presenting a DPIA's residual risk to a nervous steering committee, and downloadable revision toolkits. The link lives in the description below. Take a breather, and here's your self-test for the road. Name the 3 automatic DPIA triggers from Article 35 without peeking. Then, join me in Chapter 15. See you there.